Hello and welcome to episode 72 of CultureWatch Radio. I'm Mark Rabich and with me is Bill Muhlenberg. G'day to you, Bill.
Hey, always great to be with you.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. Now, today we're talking about Naomi Wolf, and you've written in the last week or so 4 articles in reference to a bit of a change of heart in Naomi's life. But first of all, who is she and why it's so important what she's been talking about?
Yeah, well, certainly if you're any kind of a lefty, you would certainly know of her, a long-standing American feminist, leftist, Democrat supporter, one of the darlings of the left, written quite a few books, quite well known on many fronts. Brave woman speaks out. Although, in a sense, she's always also been a bit of a rebel, you could say, a bit of an outsider. I recall, 25 years ago, perhaps, right? She had come out and spoken about abortion and said some decidedly non-left, non-feminist kinds of things like, there's actually a baby who dies in an abortion. So she's always been a little bit of a outside of the box, but still a committed lefty. But yeah, the whole, what woke up so many people, certainly the whole COVID years, right? 2 years of COVID and then the year following. That whole disastrous scenario in which it seems like in many ways we were conned massively, we were lied to, we were misinformed, we were certainly mistreated, some of the worst lockdowns in the world, including here in Melbourne, right? Our freedoms taken away, democracy in tatters, basic human rights stomped on. Again, here in Melbourne, 23 hours a day, locked into your own home, allowed to travel in that one spare hour, 5 kilometers. I mean, this whole thing was just incredible. And that really shook up Naomi Wolf and many others big time, right? A lot of people simply supported the system and went along with everything, trusted the media, trusted things like big pharma, big politics. Wow, that certainly blew Naomi Wolf out of the water. It shook up her world. In fact, the year before, she wrote a book on, really looking at the details of all this, everything from the lockdowns to big pharma to the Great Reset, to Klaus Schwab. The Body of Others was that book that came out just over a year ago. But yeah, 4 pieces now I've just done on a brand new book, which even the subtitle should fascinate many of us, but it's called Facing the Beast, Courage, Faith, and Resistance in the New Dark Age. So yeah, I thought it was such a vitally important book. I did 4 pieces in a row just on this one book, and I hope many do, in fact, get it and read it.
There's a quote from her in one of the books that you've used. She talks of stumbling into an awareness of what holds us and upholds us all. Now, she's made this about face on a fundamental level. So what really is unique about this?
Well, as we often have discussed in the past, and we know for those on the radical left to A, admit they were wrong, and then B, to publicly acknowledge that doesn't happen very often at all. Simply going back 56 years ago, the culture wars of the hippie scene, the political left, very few people I know that were part of the left, ended up turning around, moving to the right. I was one of them. There's a handful here in Australia I can think of, perhaps a few more in America. But once you're kind of in this leftist ideological box, it's kind of hard to get out. And if you do, well, you're not going to publicly tell everybody just how wrong you had been. But she was fully unashamed of saying, yeah, I got it wrong. In fact, in many ways, you could say her new book is really about that, one big apology. She woke up, she saw the light, the whole COVID thing shook her to the very core. In fact, she even has chapters in the book where she starts making public apologies. She starts saying, I'm sorry, Trump supporters. I'm sorry, Make America Great supporters. All that is, anathema to any lefty. How dare you say something like that? Here she is. I got a whole book apologizing, saying, these guys actually had it right. She goes on to say, does that make me now a Trump supporter? Well, I don't know, she says. But given how many lies we've had about everything, including Trump, well, maybe I'll become a Trump man as well. So that is a major mea culpa, a major turnaround. And you just don't get many high-profile lefties like that doing something like this. I mean, it takes a lot of guts, right? In fact, I suppose we could back it up one step and say it was exactly because all of her lefty buds, right, started abandoning her, ignoring her, instead of being invited to every, lefty New York social event and dinner. She soon became a persona non grata, right? Nobody was inviting her to the parties anymore. Nobody wanted to talk to her anymore. So that kind of set off alarm bells, right? They disowned her. So now she's happy to say, hey, after I start speaking to a lot of ordinary Americans, Christians, pro-family people, pro-America people, she's saying, wow, this is a whole new world I didn't know existed outside of the New York cocktail set. So, yeah, a major turnaround, and I love reading about it in this new book.
She talks about the misinformation that associated the COVID era, or what the mainstream media and politicians like to call misinformation. What do you think she means by that?
Yeah, well, again, she spells it out quite clearly, not just in this book, but like I say, a book a year ago that came out, both of which, by the way, I do have book reviews of. But her other book was about how, the whole COVID scene really, it was one big lie, one big hunk of misinformation. The book was called The Bodies of Others. So much of what Big Pharma was telling us, even some of the leaders that we thought at first should have known better, Trump at first, right? Fauci, certainly the World Health Organization, groups like the WEF and Schwab, right? Schwab even wrote a book on COVID and the Great Reset just at the very beginning of this whole thing. So certainly much more detail in that previous book, The Bodies of Others, but also in this book, she certainly says just on almost every front, right? The media, the medical establishment, so much of the scientific establishment, just about everybody who is, certainly our politicians, you name it, the corruption, the misinformation, the blatant lies. And a good hunk of this is because now at least we can look back. For example, because of a court order, just one of the members of Big Pharma, right, Pfizer, they had 450,000 documents that were released to the public. So Naomi and her team, along with some 3,000 plus medical and scientific experts, have been going through like mad these almost 500,000 documents that Pfizer alone had to release. And boy, the stuff they're finding there, they knew early on that a lot of this wasn't properly tested. They knew some of this as soon as they found out there were very real side effects, they didn't tell anybody. So she's got whole chapters in her brand new book just looking at Pfizer, their 500,000 documents that are now public, a matter of the public record. And hey, she says it out loud. We were lied to. We were conned. These guys were making millions, still are, millions and billions of dollars. And by the way, the connections with groups like Pfizer to a whole bunch of Chinese communist outfits. I mean, the whole thing is just scary reading. Of course, everybody else will say, oh, come on, more conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat stuff. Well, again, read the book. Look at the tons of documentation, the references, the footnotes, going back to key sources, including the Pfizer documents. So, yeah, there is a lot of misinformation out there, if not outright lies, and many of the key players, certainly including China, many of our politicians, much of the medical community, and Big Pharma, they've got a lot to answer for.
Now, you've also written that she's not a Christian yet, but refers to, for example, Ephesians 6:12 multiple times in what she's written. For those who can't recall the verse, it speaks of another realm outside of what we can see. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. In what context was Wolf using this quote?
Yeah. Well, she says often in the new book, the level of evil, the level of mass cover-up, the level of deception, the level of, just the total erasure and suppression of human rights and freedom. You can't really get that just on human terms alone, right? If you're a committed atheist or materialist, it just seems hard to account for what we witnessed in the last 3 years. There has to be something more. There has to be actually a kind of a spiritual dynamic going on here. And of course, in that she is absolutely right. We do know Ephesians 6:12, we don't wrestle just against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world. So here she is, right? First of all, she started off as a secular Jew, a nominal Jew. She certainly is no longer that. If anything, she's quite a spiritual seeking Jew. She hasn't certainly made a jump into Christianity, but as I say, she's been talking to ordinary people, at least in America, which means a whole lot of ordinary Christians, right? People she never mingled with before, people she didn't want anything to do with, and people she never met. Again, at these leftist New York cocktail parties, right? You just got the ideological leftists in full display as if they were the only people around. So, between talking to all these ordinary Americans, including so many good Christians whose lives really impressed her, and B, she mentions a book that a lot of Christians would know about, actually. Jonathan Cahn is a Messianic Jew. He used to be an atheist. He became a Christian, so he's a Messianic Jew. He's written a lot of books that a lot of Christians know about, but she actually spends a whole chapter on one of his books. Back last year, 2022, Cahn wrote The Return of the Gods. Now, in a nutshell, the thesis of that book is simply this. The Old Testament story makes it clear. There is one true God, but there's plenty of false gods, fake gods, pagan gods, idols, the whole bit. When God and his people push ahead, and when Israel was faithful to the covenant and to Yahweh, well, that kind of displaced all these false gods, gods really of the demonic realm. But as Israel became more and more disobedient, spiritually bankrupt, right, they then effectively pushed Yahweh out of the picture, turned their back on God. And so Jonathan Cahn's message in his book is, when we do this, well, guess what? We have this spiritual vacuum. It's got to be filled somehow. So what happens? You get a return of the gods, all these former false pagan deities, whatever you will, whether angelic beings or satanic creatures, whatever they might be. If you get rid of the one true God, well, something's got to take his place. And so you get all these spiritual forces rushing back in. And for Naomi Wolf, she says, this explains in such a very profound and thorough way what I'm experiencing today as a secular Jew. How do you account for this? How do you explain this mass delusion, mass deception? There has to be something more than just the material, the political explanation. There has to be a spiritual dynamic at work. So as I say, she hasn't now embraced Christianity, but she is certainly open to it. And she's certainly open now to renouncing her secular Judaism and saying, hey, there's a whole spiritual realm out there, which me and all my buddies, we never paid any attention to. So again, another reason why she's pretty remarkable, why this book is pretty remarkable. And wow, if you can get hardcore public intellectuals like her, right? And we can think of others, right? Ayaan Hirsi Ali, former Muslim, former atheist, who's now come out and said she's a Christian. Think of Jordan Peterson, who's either, maybe he's there or he's moving in that direction. This is big time stuff. The old atheism doesn't work. The old materialism doesn't work. And when people like Naomi Wolf can really start to see the light, wow, we better stand up, take notice.
I went to her website just in researching this, and it's called Daily Clout. And the first thing that I saw was a video, which apparently is one of a series of videos that she's been recently doing, where she's reading the Geneva Bible and she's reading through Exodus. And not only is she reading from the Bible, albeit the Old Testament, but she's talking about Christian things, and she's talking about how certain elements of that text were foreshadowing Jesus coming. And I'm reading this and just or listening to this and just thinking, oh, it's amazing. So, yeah, I guess it's interesting to consider her journey at this point in time. And I noticed on one of your articles that you wrote, you had a commenter that said maybe the church should take notice of Wolf's humility as an example to follow in terms of apologizing for, during the COVID lockdowns and all that, for contributing to societal panic by giving up the habit of meeting together and not taking any meaningful stand against forced medical procedures, that sort of thing. Could God be using someone like Wolf to shame us?
Well, yeah, I think so. As we just mentioned, if God can use people like Jordan Peterson, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, there's others. Tom Holland wrote a great book recently, Dominion, Defending the Faith. He's not a Christian. Even Douglas Murray, right, the atheist from England who's coming to Australia in a few months' time. A lot of these guys are really having to rethink. And they are often saying more about Christian truths and values than a lot of Christians are, right? I always say if God can use Balaam's ass to share truth, well, guess what? He can use anybody. And if the church is not going to open its mouth and say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done, well, hey, God can raise up a secular Jew, Naomi Wolf, to put us to shame. And I think that's exactly right. And we've talked about this before as well, haven't we? What did we do during the COVID years? Churches, one after another, simply went lockstep right along with whatever the state said, right? You're going to be closed down for months, maybe years, not worship anymore. Okay, fine. Government said it. I'll do it. Never mind, we had brothels open, right? Gambling dens open, you name it. Liquor stores open. All that stayed open. That was fine. That wasn't a public health threat, evidently. But we did have churches closed down for months on end. And, well, again, I'm not aware of any, certainly of these big churches that did it, that have now come out and said, actually, we were wrong. I'm sorry. We shouldn't have done this. We should have stood up for the importance of public worship. In this case, the church and God comes before the state, always has to. But I'm still waiting to hear any public apology. So here you got secular Naomi Wolf, right, apologizing big time. And yet most of these churches that should have been at the forefront of all this, they're still sitting on their hands, mouth closed, as if nothing happened, as if everything is hunky-dory.
All right, sounds like a good place to finish. Bill, thanks for today's episode.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
And there's more at the CultureWatch website. Join us again next time with another episode of CultureWatch Radio.